When renowned black surgeon Marcus Reed enters an upscale store to purchase a gift, he is immediately met with condescension and prejudice from the store's owner, who judges him solely by his appearance. What begins as subtle dismissal quickly escalates into outright insults and humiliation, with the owner's racist assumptions on full display. Marcus's dignity and composure clash with the infuriating arrogance of someone blinded by their biases, creating a tense and emotional confrontation. This story highlights the deep injustice of everyday racism and the silent strength required to face it head-on. Dr. Marcus Reed stepped out of his sleek black sedan, the engine purring softly, before he clicked the key fob and silenced it. The late afternoon sunlight glinted off the car's surface, turning the metallic paint into a mirror reflecting the bustling city street. Downtown Arlington, though smaller than other metropolitan hubs, buzzed with life, a mix of high-end boutiques, cozy coffee shops, and towering law firms casting long shadows on the narrow sidewalks. Marcus adjusted the sleeves of his simple gray sweater, cashmere, but understated, and glanced up at the boutique sign, Grace & Co. Fine Timepieces. A quiet sigh escaped his lips. "Of course it's a watch shop," he muttered under his breath. He didn't need another watch. Marcus owned a collection of timepieces that could grace museum walls, though no one but his close friends would ever know. He was a surgeon of international repute, a man whose hands had saved lives in operating rooms around the world. Yet Marcus remained impossibly humble. On most days, he dressed simply, soft sweaters and slacks, an intentional armor to deflect assumptions about his wealth. The sharp, tailored suits he reserved for fundraisers and media appearances remained tucked away. Today, though, wasn't about indulgence. "Take a look at their inventory, Marcus," his assistant had urged earlier that morning as she flipped open a glossy brochure. "They're auctioning a limited edition Vacheron Perfect for your charity gala donation." So here he was, stepping into the quiet, pristine world of Grace & Co. The bell above the door chimed softly as Marcus walked in. The shop was almost oppressively quiet, the kind of silence that whispered, "If you have to ask how much, you can't afford it." The air was cool, scented faintly with wood polish and leather, and the glass cases glimmered beneath overhead spotlights. Each watch sat like a trophy, a statement of power and privilege for whoever possessed it. "Afternoon," Marcus greeted, as he stepped further inside, his voice calm and warm. He glanced around for a moment. There was a woman in her mid-50s, browsing near the back, her pearl earrings gleaming under the lights. A young couple whispered to each other near the Rolex display, their excitement barely contained. But it was the man behind the counter who caught Marcus's attention. Tall and lean, with slicked-back graying hair, the clerk wore a perfectly pressed suit. His name tag read, Jeffrey. Marcus offered him a polite nod. "I was hoping to see the auction catalog. I heard you have the new Vacheron Constantine." Jeffrey's eyes flicked over Marcus briefly. His simple gray sweater, the clean but scuffed white sneakers, the lack of anything flashy that would scream, "big spender." For a split second, Marcus noticed the shift. A tightening around the man's mouth, a faint dismissiveness in his otherwise composed expression. It was a look Marcus had seen before. "You don't belong here." Jeffrey didn't smile. "We're very busy today, sir," he said, his tone polite but clipped. "Perhaps you'd like to make an appointment for a private viewing." Marcus blinked, thrown slightly. "Oh, I don't need a private appointment. Just the catalog would be fine. I'd like to see the listings." Jeffrey tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharpening as though sizing Marcus up. "I'm afraid the auction items are reserved for serious inquiries. Only most of our collectors prefer discretion." The words landed softly, but carried an edge, subtle, but unmistakable. Marcus felt his shoulders stiffen slightly. He offered a tight smile, unbothered on the surface, but something deeper stirring within. "I assure you, my inquiry is quite serious." "Of course," Jeffrey replied, the corners of his lips twitching into what might have been a smirk. "But we often find that certain pieces require a certain clientele. If you're looking for something more affordable, our standard collection is just here." He gestured toward a side case near the door, the one holding quartz movements and entry-level pieces. Marcus stared at him for a moment, the weight of the insult sinking in. Jeffrey didn't know him, had no idea he'd spent his morning performing a 12-hour surgery to save a child's life, or that his single watch collection was worth more than the man's salary for the next decade. Instead, all Jeffrey saw was a black man in a gray sweater. Marcus's fingers flexed slightly at his side, but he forced a neutral expression. Breathe. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. I see, Marcus said evenly, his voice measured. Are you suggesting I can't afford to look at the auction catalog? Jeffrey's smile didn't falter. Not at all, sir. I simply like to ensure we don't waste anyone's time. The response was so smooth, so coated in a professional veneer, that anyone listening might have missed the insult entirely. But Marcus didn't miss it. He could feel his pulse quicken, though outwardly he remained calm. He wasn't here for a confrontation, but he also wasn't in the habit of shrinking back. Would you mind getting your manager? Marcus asked, still polite but firm. Jeffrey's smile faltered for the first time. The manager's busy at the moment. As I said, we're handling several high-priority clients today. Perhaps you'd like to try again later. From the back of the store, the woman with the pearl earrings glanced up. Her brow furrowed slightly, sensing the tension. The young couple near the Rolex display quieted as they exchanged glances. Marcus looked Jeffrey in the eye, his voice lowering just a touch. I'll wait. Jeffrey's jaw twitched, clearly irritated by Marcus's refusal to budge. For a moment, it seemed like he might argue, but then he turned sharply on his heel, muttering something under his breath as he disappeared into a back room. Marcus exhaled slowly, his hands resting in his pockets as he scanned the store. Moments like this were familiar. Too familiar. The subtle ways people dismissed him or underestimated him. It didn't matter that he was one of the best surgeons in the country, or that he'd sat on boards of hospitals, rubbing elbows with senators and CEOs. To some people, none of that mattered. All they saw was his skin. The quiet tap of heels pulled him from his thoughts. Marcus turned to see a woman emerging from the back, a tall brunette with sharp features and a crisp navy suit. Her name tag read, Marianne Weston, manager. Good afternoon, sir, Marianne said smoothly, her tone warmer than Jeffrey's but still guarded. How can I assist you? Marcus offered her a polite smile. I'm here to see the auction catalog for the Vacheron Constantin. Your colleague said I might not be qualified to view it. Marianne blinked, taken aback. Her gaze flicked briefly to the empty counter where Jeffrey had stood moments before, realization dawning on her face. I'm so sorry for any confusion. Of course you're welcome to see the catalog. If you'd just give me a moment. No need, Marcus cut in, his tone calm but deliberate. I'll wait until your colleague returns. I'd like to hear from him directly why he assumed I wasn't qualified. Marianne stiffened slightly, but Marcus caught it. The subtle shift in her posture, the faint flicker of guilt she knew. The young couple near the Rolex case was openly watching now, their curiosity piqued. The woman with the pearl earrings pretended to browse, though her eyes lingered on Marcus. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, as Marianne struggled to respond. Marcus Reed had spent years navigating rooms just like this one, filled with people who decided who he was before he ever opened his mouth. Today, though, he wasn't going to let it slide. Today, they were going to hear him. Marianne Weston, the boutique's manager, stood frozen for a brief second, just long enough for Marcus to see the wheels turning in her head. She was calculating, considering her response, and Marcus recognized that look too well. It was the face of someone trying to decide whether to clean up a colleague's mistake or double down on it. Marianne finally offered a small, practiced smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. I can assure you, Dr. Reed, Marcus supplied evenly. Dr. Marcus Reed. Her smile faltered slightly at the title, though she recovered quickly. Dr. Reed, I'm certain there's been a misunderstanding, and I'd be happy to assist you personally if you'll just… Marcus cut her off, his voice calm but firm. I appreciate your attempt to smooth this over, Ms. Weston, but I'd still like to speak to Jeffrey directly. After all, he's the one who decided I wasn't a serious customer. The words hung heavy in the air, drawing sidelong glances from the young couple, still pretending to browse the Rolex case. The woman with the pearls had stopped pretending altogether, openly watching now, her brows furrowed in disapproval. Of course, Marianne said tightly. Let me just retrieve him. She disappeared into the back room, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. Marcus exhaled slowly, his fingers curling around the edge of his phone in his pocket. The familiar knot of frustration had settled in his chest, but he forced himself to keep his composure. This wasn't the first time. God knew it wouldn't be the last. But the sting never fully dulled. It wasn't just Jeffrey's words, it was the ease with which he'd said them, the confidence that no one would call him out a certain clientele. When Jeffrey re-emerged, his face was carefully blank, but his stiff posture betrayed his irritation. Marianne trailed behind him, her expression guarded. Jeffrey stopped in front of Marcus, his gaze hardening. "I hear you requested me, sir," he said, his voice clipped, the word sir, a formality devoid of respect. Marcus smiled faintly, though his eyes remained cool. "That's correct. I'd like to know why you assumed I wasn't qualified to view the auction catalog." Jeffrey's jaw tightened. He glanced quickly at Marianne, as though hoping she'd step in and save him, but she remained silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I never said that," Jeffrey replied defensively, his tone sharpening. "I simply informed you that the auction pieces are reserved for clients who meet certain expectations." Marcus arched an eyebrow, unblinking. "And what expectations would those be?" Jeffrey's face turned redder, but his mouth set stubbornly. "We deal with collectors, serious buyers who appreciate the exclusivity of these pieces. It's our policy to ensure we don't waste anyone's time." "Interesting," Marcus said softly. He let the silence stretch for a beat, long enough to make Jeffrey shift uncomfortably. "And you decided, on sight, that I couldn't be one of those buyers?" Jeffrey opened his mouth to respond, but Marianne finally stepped in, her voice cutting through the tension. "I think there's been enough misunderstanding here." She shot Jeffrey a warning glance, before turning back to Marcus, her tone smooth but clipped. "Dr. Reed, I'd be more than happy to retrieve the auction catalog for you now." Marcus didn't move, his gaze still locked on Jeffrey. "No, thank you. I'm not here to spend my money in a place where assumptions about who belongs are made so carelessly." Jeffrey's expression darkened, but Marianne's eyes widened slightly, panic flickering behind them. "Dr. Reed, please," she said quickly, her professional mask slipping. "Let's not escalate this further." Marcus let out a quiet, humorless chuckle, though there was no warmth in it. "You're worried about escalation. Perhaps you should have worried about that before your employee decided to humiliate me in front of your customers." The woman with the pearls suddenly stepped forward, her voice breaking the thick silence. "Excuse me," she said sharply, glaring at Jeffrey. "Are you seriously going to let him walk out of here after how you treated him? I've been shopping here for years, and I've never seen such disrespect." Jeffrey flinched, his face paling slightly. "This has nothing to do with you, ma'am." "It does now," the woman snapped. She turned to Marcus, her face softening slightly. "I'm so sorry you've had to deal with this. It's disgraceful." "Thank you," Marcus said simply. Offering her a nod, Marianne stepped forward, clearly desperate to regain control. "Dr. Reed, please, allow me to make this right. You have my sincerest apologies, and will ensure this matter is addressed internally." Marcus regarded her for a moment, considering her words. He knew what she was really saying. "Please don't make this public." But Marcus didn't owe them his silence. "I appreciate your apology, Ms. Weston," he said finally, his voice steady. "But an apology doesn't erase the damage that's been done. I'll take my business elsewhere." He turned and walked toward the door, his strides purposeful. The boutique was silent behind him, save for Jeffrey's muffled protest as Marianne whispered something furiously in his ear. Out on the sidewalk, the cool breeze hit Marcus's face as he exhaled, releasing the tension that had been coiling in his chest. He didn't look back at the store, even as he heard the faint chime of the bell as another customer entered. The frustration simmered beneath the surface, but so did something else. Resolve. This wasn't about a watch. Marcus had enough of those to last a lifetime. This was about dignity, about respect, about refusing to let someone else decide his worth. As he walked to his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw his assistant's name flashing on the screen. "Marcus," she chirped when he answered. "How did it go? Did you see the catalog I told you? The Vacheron is a—" "I won't be purchasing from Grace & Co., Marcus said quietly. There was a pause. "Oh?" Her voice softened slightly. "What happened?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, then replied, "Let's just say their certain clientele Doesn't include people like me. His assistant exhaled sharply, understanding immediately. Marcus, I'm so sorry. Don't be, Marcus said firmly. It's their loss. He ended the call, slipping his phone back into his pocket as he climbed into the driver's seat of his car. As he sat there for a moment, staring out at the bustling street, Marcus thought about the woman in the pearls, about the young couple sneaking glances his way, about Jeffrey's smug smirk and Marianne's desperate backpedaling. This wasn't over. He might not have bought their watch, but the world was going to hear about what happened today. Marcus Reed wasn't the type to back down quietly. Marcus sat behind the wheel of his car, staring at the dashboard while the hum of the city filled the silence. Normally, his car was a haven, a space where he could gather himself after long, grueling surgeries or high-stakes meetings. Today, though, it felt too quiet. He replayed the encounter in his mind. Jeffrey's sneering dismissal, Marianne's frantic attempt to salvage the moment, the woman with the pearls stepping in to break the silence. It didn't sit right. It never did. But something about today had pushed him further than usual. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at it. A message from his assistant, Emily. Checking in. Everything okay? Marcus exhaled slowly, his thumb hovering over the screen. He typed a response. Fine. But we're taking this further. Let's call the press. 3 hours later, Marcus stood on the sidewalk across from Grayson Kosu, his arms crossed tightly as the early evening crowds bustled past him. The watch boutique now gleamed under soft gold lighting, its glass cases proudly on display for anyone who happened to walk by. Except, of course, people like him. Next to him, Emily scrolled through her phone, checking updates. I got a hold of Mitchell Carter at the Post. He's sending a photographer and a reporter over right now. They'll want your statement. Marcus nodded. Good. Let's make sure this isn't swept under the rug. Emily hesitated for a moment. You know this might get messy, right? Once the press gets involved, you'll be opening yourself up to scrutiny. You sure you're ready for that? Marcus turned to look at her, his expression calm but resolute. I'm not worried about me. This is bigger than just one incident. If we don't call this out, it'll keep happening. She gave a small nod, her face softening. You're right. Just be prepared. They'll fight back. 20 minutes later, Mitchell Carter arrived, a lanky man in his late 40s with a rumpled jacket and the kind of sharp-eyed curiosity that marked him as a seasoned journalist. He shook Marcus's hand firmly. Dr. Reed, Mitchell said with a nod. Emily filled me in. This isn't the first story I've heard about Grayson's, but it's the first time someone's willing to go on record. I respect that. I'm not afraid of the truth, Marcus replied simply. Mitchell smiled faintly, pulling a notepad from his pocket. I appreciate that. Let's get this right. He gestured toward the boutique across the street. Walk me through what happened. Marcus recounted the entire encounter. Jeffrey's dismissive tone, the patronizing suggestion to check the cheaper cases, and Marianne's attempt to patch the damage without ever acknowledging its source. Mitchell listened intently, scribbling furiously as Marcus spoke. When he finished, Mitchell looked up. And what do you hope comes of this? Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. I want accountability. Apologies aren't enough if there's no systemic change. I want them to own up to their behavior. And for the world to see it for what it is. Mitchell nodded slowly, his gaze steady. We'll run the story. If they've got skeletons, we'll find them. 2 days later, the story broke. The headline on the Arlington Post read, Doctor denied service at upscale watch boutique, a question of bias or policy. The article detailed the incident in Marcus's own words, painting a damning picture of the boutique's handling of the situation. Mitchell's investigative instincts didn't stop there. He dug deeper, uncovering other complaints of subtle discrimination against customers who didn't fit the profile. None had spoken up publicly, until now. The story spread like wildfire, news stations picked it up, and social media exploded with outrage. Typical elitism. I hope that store goes bankrupt. Racism dressed up in a suit and tie. Dr. Marcus Reed is a hero for standing up to this nonsense. By the time Marcus saw the article, his phone was buzzing nonstop. Friends, colleagues, and strangers flooded him with messages of support, but not all the feedback was positive. The backlash against Grace & Co. sparked a counter-reaction. Online trolls emerged, twisting the story into one of victimhood for the boutique. He's playing the race card to get attention. Businesses should have the right to serve who they want. People like him just want handouts. Marcus stared at those comments, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. Even in the face of truth, there were always people who refused to see it. 3 days after the story broke, Marcus received an unexpected call. "Dr. Reed?" a gruff voice said on the line. "This is Officer Daniels with Arlington PD. I'm calling regarding a formal complaint filed by Grace & Co." Marcus frowned, his shoulders stiffening. "A complaint?" "Yes, sir," Daniels replied curtly. "They're claiming harassment, stating that your public comments have damaged their business. I'll need you to come in for a brief statement." Marcus's blood ran cold, but his voice remained even. "Harassment? For speaking about how I was treated?" "Sir, I'm just following up on the complaint," Daniels said dismissively. "I suggest you cooperate." At the police station later that afternoon, Marcus sat across the table from Officer Daniels, who wore a starched uniform and a pinched expression. Daniels flipped through a file folder as though its contents were of deep importance. "You understand that public accusations can cause real damage to a business's reputation," Daniels said, his tone implying guilt. Marcus's gaze was steady. "You understand that discrimination can cause real damage to someone's dignity, don't you?" Daniels didn't respond. He pushed the file toward Marcus. "Grayson's claims that your statements have led to threats against their staff and loss of revenue. They're accusing you of inciting harassment." Marcus felt a flicker of anger. "They're the ones who humiliated me. I simply told the truth." Daniels shrugged, clearly indifferent. "We're investigating both sides, but I'd recommend you tone things down before this gets worse." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but sharp. "You're suggesting that I stay silent?" "I'm suggesting you be smart about this," Daniels replied coolly. "You're already in the spotlight. It'd be a shame if this escalated." Marcus met his gaze evenly. "I'm not backing down." As Marcus left the station, his mind raced. Grace & Co. wasn't just refusing to acknowledge their actions, they were doubling down, weaponizing the system to paint him as the aggressor. This wasn't about watches anymore, it was about power. His phone buzzed again, and Marcus answered without checking the caller ID. "Marcus, it's Mitchell," came the journalist's voice. "I just got word that Grayson's filed a lawsuit against you for defamation. It's an intimidation tactic, but it's real." Marcus stopped in his tracks, a cold anger settling over him. "They think they can scare me into silence." "That's exactly what they're banking on," Mitchell said, "but it's not going to work, is it?" Marcus's grip on his phone tightened, his voice quiet but filled with steel. "No, it's not." Marcus drove home from the police station, his hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. The late afternoon sun streaked golden light across the city skyline, but it did nothing to ease the storm building inside him. Harassment? Defamation? He replayed Officer Daniels's dismissive tone, Grace & Co.'s audacity to paint him as the villain in this narrative. They weren't just trying to silence him. They were weaponizing the system to punish him for speaking out. The arrogance of it boiled his blood. When Marcus pulled into his driveway, his phone buzzed again. It was Mitchell. He answered, already bracing himself. "They're playing dirty, Marcus," Mitchell said without preamble. "I just got my hands on Grayson's statement to the press. They're doubling down hard." Marcus sighed. "What does it say?" "They're painting this whole thing as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion," Mitchell explained. "They're claiming you were aggressive and disruptive. They've even brought up that false harassment complaint to make you look like the one at fault." Marcus gripped the phone tighter. "And people are going to believe them, aren't they?" Mitchell hesitated. "Some will. You know how this works. A powerful business like Grayson's has friends in high places. They're pulling every string to discredit you." Marcus shut off his car and stepped into the house. His voice was calm, but edged with steel. "They can smear me all they want. I'm not backing down." The next morning, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through his phone as the headlines rolled in. Grace & Co. fires back at discrimination allegations. Respected doctor accused of harassing boutique staff. Both sides speak out. Was it racism or a misunderstanding? The words made his stomach turn. Was it racism or a misunderstanding? They were already framing it as a debate, a gray area, when it had been anything but. A sharp knock on his door broke his thoughts. Marcus opened it to find Mitchell on the porch, holding a cardboard folder and a steaming cup of coffee. He raised the cup with a small smile. "Thought you could use this." Marcus stepped aside to let him in. "What's in the folder?" Mitchell placed the folder on the table, his expression serious. "Receipts." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What kind of receipts?" "Grayson's history," Mitchell replied, flipping open the folder. I dug deeper. Found a pattern. Over the past 3 years, they've had multiple complaints filed against them with the local Better Business Bureau and other agencies. Everything from refusal of service to subtle discriminatory practices. No one ever followed through. "The case is just vanished." Marcus frowned. "Vanished?" Mitchell nodded. "I have a source in City Hall who says some of those complaints were suppressed. Buried under mountains of red tape. It's like someone was protecting them." The word sent a chill through Marcus. "They've been getting away with this for years." "And not just with customers," Mitchell added, his voice dropping. "I reached out to a former employee. An anonymous source. They confirmed that management had unwritten rules about serving undesirable clientele." Marcus's jaw tightened, anger swirling in his chest. "They think they're untouchable." "They did," Mitchell corrected, "but they didn't count on someone like you." Marcus looked down at the folder, a fire igniting inside him. "Then let's make sure everyone sees who they really are." Later that day, Marcus sat across from Rachel Davis, a high-powered civil rights attorney recommended by a colleague. Her office overlooked the city skyline, but the view was lost on Marcus as Rachel skimmed through Mitchell's findings. "You've got a case," Rachel said finally, looking up. "A big one." Marcus leaned forward. "How big?" "Grayson Co. isn't just guilty of individual acts of discrimination," Rachel said, tapping the folder. "This looks systemic. If we can prove that management knowingly enforced discriminatory policies, we're talking civil suits, federal investigations, the works." Marcus exhaled, the weight of her words sinking in. "What's the next step?" "We file a civil lawsuit," Rachel replied, her tone sharp and confident. "We'll make it clear that this isn't just about you, it's about everyone they've ever discriminated against. That's what they're afraid of." Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening. "Do it. File the suit." Rachel smiled faintly. "Good. But be ready, Dr. Reed. They're going to fight you tooth and nail. They'll play every dirty trick they can to paint you as the villain." Marcus met her gaze evenly. "I'm ready." By the time news broke about the lawsuit, the story had taken on a life of its own. Civil rights attorney files lawsuit against Grayson Co. for systemic discrimination. The headlines went viral. News anchors debated the case on morning shows, legal experts weighed in, and social media exploded with hashtags like "accountability for Graysons" and "justice for all." Protesters gathered outside Grayson's flagship store, holding signs and chanting slogans. "No justice, no peace, equal treatment for all." Marcus watched the news coverage from his office, his chest tightening as he saw the crowds growing. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. Emily knocked softly on his door, stepping inside with a small smile. "You've started something big, Marcus." "It's bigger than me now," Marcus replied quietly. "And that's how it should be." But not everyone was celebrating. Late that evening, Marcus received a call from an unknown number. He answered cautiously, and a familiar voice growled on the other end. "Dr. Reed," the voice sneered. "I hope you're enjoying the attention because it's going to ruin you." It was Jeffrey. Marcus's hand tightened around the phone. "I didn't expect to hear from you, Jeffrey." "You think you can drag us through the mud and get away with it?" Jeffrey spat. "You don't know who you're messing with. People like me don't lose to people like you." Marcus's voice was cold. "People like me? Say what you mean, Jeffrey." There was a beat of silence. Then Jeffrey hissed, "You've made a mistake, and you're going to regret it." Marcus hung up, his heart pounding. He stared at his phone, his mind racing. The words were a threat, and Jeffrey had made one thing clear. Grayson Co. was going to fight this with everything they had. The next day, Marcus's resolve was tested even further. On his way to meet Rachel at her office, He noticed the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. A patrol car was tailing him. Marcus pulled to the side of the road, his heart thudding heavily as Officer Daniels approached his window. "License and registration," Daniels said curtly, his expression unreadable. Marcus handed over his documents without a word. "Is there a problem, officer?" Daniels glanced at the papers before looking back at Marcus with a thin smirk. "Routine check." "Routine?" Marcus repeated, his tone calm but pointed. "Unless you have something to hide," Daniels replied. Marcus's fingers curled tightly around the steering wheel. "You're harassing me again." Daniels shrugged, handing back Marcus's license. "Drive safe, Dr. Reed." As Daniels walked back to his car, Marcus sat frozen in his seat. They were tightening the screws, trying to rattle him, trying to make him back down, but they didn't understand who they were dealing with. Marcus pulled back onto the road, his jaw set and his focus unshakable. If they wanted a fight, he was ready for war. The courthouse steps were swarming with reporters, cameras clicked, flashes went off, and voices clamored for attention. Marcus Reed stepped out of the car, his polished black suit and calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the chaos around him. Behind him, Rachel Davis adjusted her leather bag, leaning in as they walked toward the entrance. "They're going to throw everything they have at us today. Don't let them bait you." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "I've been underestimated my whole life, I'm used to it." The doors opened to reveal the marbled grandeur of the courthouse lobby. At the far end, Jeffrey Grayson and his lawyers stood like statues. Jeffrey's face was hard, his suit impeccable, but his eyes burned with a mixture of contempt and desperation. When his gaze locked with Marcus's, Jeffrey's smirk was sharp enough to cut glass. "You're really dragging this out, aren't you, Dr. Reed?" Jeffrey sneered as Marcus approached. "You think this charade is going to ruin me?" "No," Marcus replied calmly. "The truth will do that." Jeffrey's expression darkened. "You don't belong here. You don't belong anywhere near me." Rachel stepped forward, her tone razor-sharp. "Careful, Mr. Grayson. The more you talk, the clearer you make our case." Jeffrey ignored her, his gaze fixed on Marcus. "You're making a mistake. You think people like you can tear down people like me? We built this country. You're just a guest." The words hit like a slap, but Marcus didn't flinch. He leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough that Jeffrey, and everyone nearby, could hear him. "I'm no guest, Jeffrey, and I'm done letting men like you pretend you own the place." Jeffrey's jaw clenched, but before he could retort, one of his lawyers ushered him away, whispering frantically in his ear. Marcus straightened, adjusting his tie as Rachel gave him a nod of approval. "You handled that perfectly," she murmured. "Now let's finish this." Inside the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. Rows of spectators and journalists filled the gallery, their murmurs fading as the bailiff called the session to order. Jeffrey Grayson sat at the defense table, his team of lawyers forming a wall around him. Across the room, Marcus sat with Rachel, his back straight, his hands clasped firmly together. The judge entered, and silence fell. "This court will hear final arguments in the matter of Reed versus Grayson Co-Counsel. You may proceed." Jeffrey's lead attorney, a sleek man in a navy blue suit, stood first. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone calculated, "we live in a world where people jump to conclusions. What happened to Dr. Reed was not discrimination, it was a simple misunderstanding. My client, Mr. Grayson, was merely protecting the integrity of his business. To suggest otherwise is to ignore the realities of running a luxury establishment." He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the jury. "Dr. Reed's accusations are not only baseless, but they've caused irreparable harm to my client's reputation and livelihood. Businesses have the right to make judgment calls about their customers." He paused, letting the words settle. "Mr. Grayson is not a villain. He's a businessman, one who has been unfairly targeted and vilified for something he did not do." As he returned to his seat, Jeffrey shot Marcus a smug glance. Marcus kept his expression blank. "Your turn," Rachel whispered. Marcus exhaled and stood, his movements deliberate. He approached the jury box, his calm presence commanding attention. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but powerful. "You've heard a lot of arguments about misunderstanding and judgment calls. But what happened to me was neither of those things." He turned slightly, his gaze moving from juror to juror. I walked into Grace & Co. like any other customer. I was polite, I was professional. And yet, I was told, without hesitation, that I didn't belong, that I should check the cheaper cases. His voice hardened, but his composure remained intact. And this isn't an isolated incident. Mr. Grayson's establishment has a pattern, a history, of treating people differently based on race. We've shown you the complaints, the testimonies, the buried evidence. It's not a mistake, it's not a misunderstanding, it's a choice. Marcus turned toward Jeffrey, meeting his glare head-on. Mr. Grayson didn't see a customer that day, he saw a threat, someone who didn't fit the image he wanted for his store, and instead of treating me with the dignity and respect every person deserves, he chose to humiliate me. Jeffrey's face reddened, but he said nothing. Marcus turned back to the jury, his voice softening. This case is not just about what happened to me. It's about what happens every day to people who are judged, not by who they are, but by what they look like. This is about accountability, about standing up to people who think they can get away with treating others like they don't matter. He paused, his words hanging in the air. I'm not asking for special treatment, I'm asking for fairness, and for justice. As he returned to his seat, the courtroom was silent. Even Jeffrey's lawyers seemed unsure how to respond. When the session adjourned, Marcus walked toward the doors with Rachel, but Jeffrey intercepted him, his face twisted with fury. You think you've won? Jeffrey hissed, his voice low and venomous. This isn't over, I'll bury you. Marcus stopped and turned slowly to face him. You don't scare me, Jeffrey, and you never will. You have no idea what you're up against, Jeffrey snapped, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Men like me don't lose to men like you. Rachel stepped between them, her expression deadly calm. Back off, Mr. Grayson. You've already said too much. Jeffrey smirked, straightening his jacket. We'll see about that. With that, he stormed off, his footsteps echoing through the marble hall. Rachel turned to Marcus, her voice quiet but firm. He's desperate, he knows he's losing. Marcus nodded, his heart pounding, but his resolve unshaken. And I'm just getting started. The following morning, an anonymous source leaked an internal memo from Grace & Co. to the Arlington Post. The document was damning. It outlined unspoken policies discouraging sales to undesirable clientele to protect the store's image. Marcus sat in his office when Mitchell called, his voice breathless with excitement. We got him, Marcus, Mitchell said. The memo's out, Grayson can't deny it anymore. Marcus's lips curled into a faint smile. Let the truth speak for itself. As Marcus stepped into the courthouse later that day, the crowd of reporters erupted with questions. Dr. Reed, did you see the leaked memo? What do you have to say about Grace & Co.'s policies? Do you think this will turn the tide? Marcus stopped briefly, his voice clear and unwavering. The truth always comes out. And for the first time in days, he felt the tide beginning to shift. The courthouse lobby was buzzing, the sound bouncing off marble floors and glass walls. The air felt heavy, thick with tension, as if everyone in the building sensed what was about to happen. This wasn't just another court case. This was a reckoning. Marcus walked in through the large double doors, every step deliberate. His calm exterior hid the fire burning inside him. He had waited for this moment, prepared for it. But the weight of the stakes pressed on his shoulders. Rachel Davis strode beside him, her face hard as steel. The leaked memo is going to blow this wide open, she murmured under her breath, leaning closer. Jeffrey knows it. He'll be desperate. He might try anything to save face. Good, Marcus replied evenly. Let him try. I'm ready. They turned the corner and stopped across the hall. Jeffrey Grayson stood near his team of lawyers, but for once, his confidence looked cracked. His polished suit and slicked-back hair couldn't disguise the tension in his clenched jaw, or the glimmer of panic in his eyes. Marcus held Jeffrey's gaze as they locked eyes. The air between them was electric, charged with something raw and unspoken. Rachel leaned in. Here we go. The courtroom was packed, overflowing with reporters, spectators, and activists. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, hands clasped, his gaze steady as the judge entered and called the room to order. The sound of people rising and sitting again echoed like a drum roll, setting the stage for what was to come. "Counsel," the judge intoned, "you may call your next witness." Rachel stood, her voice calm but commanding. "Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Jeffrey Grayson to the stand." A murmur rippled through the courtroom like a wave. Jeffrey's lawyer turned sharply toward him, whispering something in urgent, clipped tones. Jeffrey's face was stone as he rose, moving toward the witness stand with stiff, calculated steps. Marcus watched him, silent but focused. "This is it." Jeffrey was sworn in, and Rachel stepped forward, the faintest hint of a smirk playing at her lips. "Mr. Grayson," Rachel began smoothly, "can you confirm that you are the majority owner and CEO of Grayson Co.?" "Yes," Jeffrey replied, his voice clipped. "And is it your responsibility to set company policies?" "Yes." Rachel's expression didn't change as she continued. "Mr. Grayson, earlier this week, a memo was leaked to the Arlington Post, a memo from your own management team. Do you recognize this document?" She held up a printed copy of the memo, and a collective hush fell over the courtroom. Jeffrey's face paled just slightly, but he forced a smirk. "I've seen it." "Is this memo authentic?" Rachel pressed. Jeffrey's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This memo was obtained illegally." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Grayson." Jeffrey shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glaring at Rachel. "It's real," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Would you care to explain its contents?" Rachel asked, her voice sharp now. "Specifically the section instructing employees to avoid serving certain undesirable clientele to protect the store's image." Jeffrey's face hardened. "It's been taken out of context." "Oh?" Rachel arched an eyebrow, holding up the document. "I'm not sure how this could be misinterpreted. Would you like me to read it aloud?" Jeffrey's lawyer whispered something again, but Jeffrey shook his head sharply. He turned to the judge, his voice rising. "This is ridiculous. That memo isn't discriminatory. It's a business policy. We cater to a specific clientele." Rachel's voice was ice. "And who exactly do you consider undesirable clientele, Mr. Grayson?" Jeffrey glared at her, his composure fraying. "You're twisting my words." Rachel stepped closer, her tone unrelenting. "I'm simply asking you to clarify, Mr. Grayson. Who doesn't fit your store's image?" "People like Dr. Reed," Jeffrey scoffed, his lips curling into a bitter sneer. "People like him come in expecting to be treated like kings when they're clearly out of place." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he didn't react. Rachel, however, seized the moment. "Out of place?" she repeated, her voice ringing through the room. "Because of his race?" Jeffrey's face turned red, his mouth working to form words, but he only dug himself deeper. "He knew what he was doing," Jeffrey hissed. "People like him always play the victim when things don't go their way." The room fell utterly silent. Jeffrey's own lawyer looked as if he'd been punched in the gut. The judge's expression darkened as the weight of Jeffrey's words settled over the courtroom. Rachel took a slow breath, straightening. "No further questions, Your Honor." Jeffrey's lawyer leapt to his feet, desperate to clean up the damage, but the harm was already done. When the session adjourned, Marcus stood outside the courthouse, watching the storm of reporters swarming the building. Rachel stood beside him, her phone in hand. "You heard what he said in there," she said quietly. "He just exposed himself to the entire world." Marcus exhaled, his chest rising and falling with measured calm. "It's not enough to expose him," he replied. "We have to make sure he's held accountable." Rachel nodded, her expression resolute. "We will. The jury can't ignore what just happened. Jeffrey's arrogance did more for our case than we ever could." At that moment, Jeffrey stormed through the courthouse doors, surrounded by his lawyers. His face was a mask of barely contained rage, and when he saw Marcus, he froze. "You think you've won?" Jeffrey spat, stepping closer, his voice a venomous whisper. "This isn't over." Marcus turned to face him, his gaze calm and unshakable. "It's over for you, Jeffrey. The world sees who you really are now." Jeffrey's face twisted. "You people are all the same, always looking for someone to blame. You don't deserve what you have." Marcus stepped forward, his voice quiet but filled with authority. "What I have is mine because I earned it, and what you've lost is yours because you let your hate blind you." Jeffrey's fists clenched at his sides, but one of his lawyers grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "We're leaving," the lawyer muttered. Jeffrey glared at Marcus one last time before turning away, his back retreating into the chaos of reporters and flashing cameras. Marcus stood there for a moment, letting the tension settle as the crowd of reporters turned to him. Rachel leaned in. "This isn't over yet, but it's close. The jury saw it. The world saw it." Marcus nodded slowly, exhaling as the weight of the moment pressed on his chest. The truth had been revealed, but what came next, whether justice would truly be served, was still uncertain. He turned to Rachel, his voice steady. "Let's finish this." The air inside the courtroom felt electric as the jury returned. Every shuffle, every breath, was magnified in the stillness. Marcus sat tall, his hands clasped together, his expression calm, even though his pulse thundered in his ears. Beside him, Rachel was poised and focused, but her fingers drummed lightly against the table, her only visible sign of tension. Across the aisle, Jeffrey Grayson's face was pale, his confidence stripped away. He leaned toward his lawyer, who was whispering something Marcus couldn't hear. But it didn't matter. The weight of everything Jeffrey had said and done sat heavy in the room like a stone, and Marcus knew the moment of reckoning had come. The jury foreman rose, holding a slip of paper, his face unreadable. "In the matter of Reed versus Grayson Co., we, the jury, find the defendant." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Liable for racial discrimination, harassment, and violating federal anti-discrimination laws." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by whispers. Rachel exhaled sharply, a small, satisfied smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Jeffrey's lawyer shot to his feet, his voice trembling with anger. "Your Honor, we intend to appeal." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "You'll have that opportunity, counselor. Sit down." Marcus turned to Rachel, his voice low. "We did it." She nodded. "We did." From across the room, Jeffrey sat frozen, his face unreadable. The reality of his defeat had finally sunk in. His empire, his carefully curated image, had cracked wide open for the world to see. Outside the courthouse, the plaza was alive with energy. Supporters waved signs, news crews jostled for position, and cameras zoomed in on Marcus as he stepped down the courthouse steps, flanked by Rachel. The cheers of the crowd rolled over him, but he stayed grounded, his focus steady as he approached the podium set up for the press conference. Rachel took the mic first. "Today's decision is a victory, not just for Marcus Reed, but for justice and accountability. This case was never just about one man or one business. It was about drawing a line and saying discrimination has no place in our communities." A roar of agreement rose from the crowd. Rachel turned to Marcus, giving him a nod. "Your turn." Marcus stepped forward. For a moment, he looked out at the sea of faces, strangers, supporters, people who had fought for him, even without knowing him. The weight of their trust humbled him, but it also gave him strength. "Thank you," he began, his deep voice calm but carrying across the plaza. "Thank you for standing with me, for believing in this fight." The crowd quieted, listening intently. "This case wasn't about me walking into a luxury store, or about one man's ignorance," Marcus continued. "It was about something much bigger. It was about every person who's been judged, dismissed, or mistreated because of what they look like. This fight wasn't just mine, it was ours." He paused, his voice softening but no less powerful. "The truth is, we still have work to do. People like Jeffrey Grayson aren't rare, and the systems that allow them to thrive still exist. But today, we proved that when we stand up, when we refuse to be silenced, we can make change." A ripple of applause swelled through the crowd. Marcus met the gaze of a young woman in the front row, holding a sign that read, "Your fight is our fight." She smiled through tears, and Marcus felt his chest tighten. "This is just the beginning," he finished, "and I won't stop here." The crowd erupted into cheers as Marcus stepped back, his heart full. Days turned into weeks, and the fallout from the verdict rippled outward like a stone dropped in a pond. Jeffrey Grayson became a cautionary tale. The leaked memo, his disastrous testimony, and the jury's ruling dominated headlines. Grayson Co.'s reputation was shattered. Protests outside the store continued, growing larger until Jeffrey was forced to close its doors. Temporarily. Though many suspected it would be permanent, suppliers cut ties, and customers abandoned him in droves. The facade Jeffrey had built so carefully over the years crumbled. But Marcus didn't waste time celebrating Jeffrey's downfall. Instead, he turned his focus toward building something better. With Rachel's help, he partnered with local organizations to launch the READ Initiative, a program designed to help small businesses and entrepreneurs of color succeed. "I don't want to tear people down," Marcus told a reporter during an interview. "I want to lift people up. That's how we change things, by creating opportunity where it's been denied." One evening, Marcus sat in his office overlooking the city skyline, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. The faint hum of traffic rose from below, but the room was quiet. Rachel knocked lightly on the door before stepping in. "Long day?" Marcus glanced at her with a faint smile. "Something like that." She set down a folder and perched on the edge of his desk. "You should be proud of what you've done here. This program, it's going to change lives." Marcus leaned back, his gaze drifting out the window. "I hope so. But I keep thinking about all the people who didn't get their day in court. People who never got the chance to fight back." Rachel studied him for a moment. "You can't fix everything, Marcus. But you're showing people what's possible." He nodded slowly, her words settling over him. "I guess I'm just tired of the fight sometimes." Rachel smiled faintly. "The fight's not over, but you're not fighting alone anymore." Marcus looked at her, gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Rachel, for everything." "Don't mention it," she replied, standing. "We've still got a lot to do." As she left, Marcus turned back to the window. The city stretched out before him, alive and endless. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would always be another Jeffrey, another fight. But for the first time, he felt ready. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Epilogue. 1 year later. The READ Initiative's headquarters buzzed with activity. Entrepreneurs mingled at tables covered with laptops, grant applications, and business plans. Marcus walked through the space, smiling as he listened to people exchanging ideas and stories of their growing businesses. "Dr. Reed?" Marcus turned to see a young man standing nervously near the entrance. "Yes?" The young man hesitated before holding out his hand. "I just wanted to say thank you. I've been following your story since the Grayson trial. What you did, it inspired me to start my own business. I wouldn't be here without this program." Marcus shook his hand, his smile warm. "You got here because you believed in yourself. Keep going." The young man nodded, his face lighting up as he turned back to his work. Marcus stood there for a moment, watching as the room buzzed with energy. It reminded him of the first time he'd walked into that small shop, how it had all started with a single moment of defiance. A voice pulled him from his thoughts. "It's a good day, isn't it?" Rachel appeared beside him, holding 2 cups of coffee. "It is," Marcus replied, accepting one of the cups. "But we're just getting started." Rachel chuckled. "I'd expect nothing less." Together, they stood at the edge of the room, watching as the seeds they'd planted began to bloom. And in that moment, Marcus knew change was possible. One fight at a time, the sunlight streamed through the large windows of the READ Initiative headquarters as Marcus stood at the front of a conference room, speaking to a small but eager group of young entrepreneurs. He could see himself in their faces, in their hunger for opportunity, their hope for a better future. "You are your greatest investment," Marcus told them, his voice steady and warm. "The world might tell you no. People might underestimate you, dismiss you, or try to make you feel small. But you can't let that stop you. Build anyway, succeed anyway, be undeniable." As he finished, the room erupted into applause, and Marcus allowed himself a small smile. These moments, the quiet victories, were what made the fight worth it. They were what kept him moving forward. Reflecting on the past year, Marcus couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed and how much hadn't. The case against Jeffrey Grayson had been a turning point, a moment when Marcus refused to let someone else's prejudice dictate his worth. But the story, as much as it centered around him, was never just about him. The confrontation in that luxury store had been a microcosm of a larger truth, one that countless others had faced. The sting of being judged by the color of your skin before a single word leaves your mouth. Marcus knew his experience wasn't unique. That's what drove him to fight back. The lawsuit hadn't just exposed Jeffrey Grayson's ignorance and cruelty, it had forced an entire community to confront its own complacency. Local businesses began reassessing their policies. Conversations about race and equality, once whispered or ignored, grew louder. Some people resented the change, while others embraced it. Change, Marcus knew, was slow. It was messy. It was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. For Marcus personally, the journey had been transformative. When he first walked into that store, he hadn't expected to become a symbol. He hadn't sought the attention, the headlines, or the praise. If he were honest, there were moments he had resented it. The way his life had become a spectacle, dissected by strangers. But as time passed, Marcus understood that this wasn't just his burden. It was his responsibility. Before the lawsuit, he had always used his success quietly. He funded scholarships for students of color, mentored young professionals, and advocated for representation in healthcare. But this experience taught him that silence, however well-intentioned, was no longer an option. "I was never the kind of person who wanted to make noise," Marcus admitted to a journalist in a follow-up interview months after the verdict. "I thought I could change things quietly, behind the scenes. But the truth is, silence doesn't serve progress. Sometimes, you have to be loud, you have to stand up, and demand to be heard." The reporter had smiled, noting how his words carried the weight of someone who had been tested, but refused to break. Jeffrey Grayson's downfall, though satisfying, wasn't the end of the story. Marcus had seen firsthand how deeply systemic racism ran. Not just in corporate policies, but in the minds of individuals. People like Jeffrey didn't exist in isolation. They were shaped by a world that allowed their behavior to thrive unchecked. In the weeks following the verdict, Marcus received messages from strangers across the country. People who shared their own stories of humiliation and injustice. One woman wrote, "I never fought back. I wish I had your strength." Another person, a young black man from a small town, told Marcus his story of being wrongfully turned away from a job. "They said I wasn't the right fit," the man wrote, "but you reminded me that I belong anywhere I choose to be." These stories reinforced a truth that Marcus had always known, but now felt in his bones. The fight wasn't just about one moment or one person. It was about shifting the culture. It was about creating a world where no one had to prove they deserved dignity. Marcus's journey also inspired those closest to him. Rachel, his lawyer, and now close confidant, went on to take more cases like his, defending others who had been silenced or mistreated. "Marcus set a precedent," Rachel said at a recent panel on civil rights. "He showed people that accountability isn't impossible. It's hard, it's exhausting, but it's worth the fight." Even Mitchell, the hesitant store manager, who had initially let his fear outweigh his conscience, found redemption. He quit his job at Grayson Co. shortly after the case and reached out to Marcus privately. "I failed you that day," Mitchell admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I saw what was happening, and I did nothing. I'm sorry." Marcus had looked at him, his expression unreadable before replying, "It's not too late to do something now." Mitchell took those words to heart, volunteering for local community organizations and mentoring young workers to ensure they understood the power of standing up for others. As Marcus sat in his office one afternoon, he thought back to his parents, who had raised him with quiet dignity and fierce determination. They had always taught him to hold his head high, to treat people with kindness, and to demand the same in return. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "You can't control how people see you, but you can control how you see yourself." That, Marcus realized, was what had kept him grounded through it all. Even when Jeffrey spat insults at him, even when people doubted his story or criticized his decision to pursue legal action, Marcus had never lost sight of who he was. And now, that knowledge, that certainty, was his greatest strength. The Read Initiative continued to grow, providing grants, resources, and mentorship for minority-owned businesses. Marcus spoke at schools, conferences, and town halls, sharing his story and encouraging others to speak up when faced with injustice. At one event, a young black girl approached him, clutching a notebook. "I want to start my own business one day," she said shyly. "Can you give me advice?" Marcus knelt so he could meet her eyes. "Of course, believe in yourself, even when other people don't, and never let anyone tell you where you do or don't belong." The girl nodded, her eyes wide and hopeful. Watching her walk away, Marcus felt something click into place. That was why he fought. That was why he stood up, even when it was hard. Because every step forward, no matter how small, opened a door for someone else. As Marcus stood on a stage at a community event, looking out at the sea of faces, young, old, black, white, he felt a swell of pride. His voice carried through the crowd as he spoke the words that had become his truth. The road to justice is long, and it's not always fair. But when we stand together, when we refuse to be silent, change does happen. It's not about tearing others down, it's about building a world where everyone has a place, where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. He paused, scanning the crowd. The fight isn't over. It might never be, but every voice matters, every action counts, and together, we can make a difference. The crowd erupted into applause, but Marcus didn't feel like the hero they painted him to be. He was just one man, doing his part. One voice among many. As he stepped off the stage, a young boy tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Reed, are you going to keep fighting?" Marcus smiled, his gaze steady. "Always." Because the world needed fighters. The world needed people who wouldn't back down. And Marcus Reed was ready for whatever came next.